So in this mind map, we are going to talk about constructs, variables, and operational definitions. So let's start off by talking about construct. So a construct, this is an internal attribute or characteristic that cannot be directly observed but are useful for describing or explaining behavior. This is especially true for psychology because most of the things that we want to know about in psychology are constructs that we have to figure out how to measure those. So things like test anxiety or anxiety in general or anger or things like that, which they're constructs, they're ideas, but we have ways to measure them based on behaviors. So once we figure out a construct, we want to figure out what the observable behavior is, because remember, constructs are not exactly directly observable. We have to observe them through behavior. Which makes them a little difficult because if we think about behavior, especially things like anger, different people react differently to anger. So we have to figure out a way to measure something over a vast majority of people. Some examples of constructs would be intelligence, life satisfaction, self-esteem, motivations, any type of emotion, anxiety, depression, happiness, things like that would all be considered constructs because we can't actually directly observe them. And we do have a lot of different ways that we measure this. For the most part, a lot of these have surveys or observable behaviors that people use pretty consistently to measure some of these things. Like for anxiety, we might look at if a person's trembling or sweaty or restless. Things like that would be observed behaviors that are usually associated with anxiety. So let's talk about variables. So variables are created by developing a construct in a measurable form. So basically these are those sweating, trembling things. These are the things that we're actually going to measure in order to observe the construct or whatever emotion or intelligence or self-satisfaction, things of that nature. So variables by definition can correspond to any characteristic that varies. We have two types of variables. We have what we call discrete variables. These are countable. They're a finite amount of time So for example, the change in your pocket would be considered a discrete variable, or the number of siblings you have would be considered a discrete variable. Things like that, things that can be counted. Continuous variables are variables that have an infinite number of possible values. They take forever to count. In fact, you would never actually be able to count everything in a continuous variable. So for example, age or height or students in class, things of that nature would be considered continuous. So again, just as a overall thing, some examples of variables would be height, weight, eye color, scores on a depression inventory, things of that would be considered a variable. And then we're going to talk more about variables beyond discrete and continuous later on in this chapter. And we're actually going to define them as 4 different types of variables. So let's do a couple examples from discrete versus continuous. So what we're going to do is we're going to get each statement. We're going to determine whether it is a discrete or a continuous statement. So our first one would be the weight of firefighters. And again, the main question to ask yourself is can weight be counted, or would just take too long to count weight? So hopefully you're telling me it would take way too long to count weight, which would make weight a continuous variable. The second one here is the number of desks, and we could say like the number of desks in a room. Could you feasibly count the number of desks in a room? Hopefully you're saying yes. If we can count the number of desks, that makes that a discrete variable. So our third example here is the number of cars sold by a dealership. Again, what we want to ask ourselves is, can we count the number of cars sold by a dealership? Now, was very specific here, but I could say in a day. Can we count the number of cars sold at a dealership in a day? And that would be yes, we can totally count that. That's an easy thing to do. That would be a discrete variable again. Okay, and our final example we're going to do for today is the number of minutes a consumer stays on a website. So the number of minutes a consumer stays on a website. Again, can we count minutes? So hopefully you're telling me, no, I cannot count the minutes, that's just not feasible, and you're going to tell me that that also is continuous. So kind of, guys, when you think about discrete versus continuous, really think about that idea of, can you count it? Is there so many minutes that you could never actually count all of the minutes? And that's where it becomes a problem. So think of it very specifically and ask yourself, can I count that? If you can count it, then that would be discrete. If you cannot count it, that would be continuous. Okay, so now let's talk about operational definitions. These kind of meld the construct and variables together. So what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at operational definitions are statements or procedures that a researcher is going to use in order to measure a specific variable. So basically, again, what we're doing is we're kind of combining that construct idea with that variable. When it comes to operational definitions, by the way, we can never be too detailed, okay? We want to be as detailed as possible because we want somebody to be able to reproduce our results. And it's very hard for somebody to reproduce our results if we're not really specific about what we're doing. So for example, if I wanted to weigh people in a study, you could say just weigh them. The procedure seems obvious, but how do we guarantee that the scale is working properly? What should you have your participants wear when they're being weighed? The weight of their street coats can vary different depending on how cold it is outside. You know, if you have a lot of jackets or layers on because it's really cold. What are they carrying in their pocket? There's so many things that can affect somebody's weight. So do you do it in the morning? Are you weighing them in the afternoon? Things like that. So we want to be very specific when we talk about how we're going to measure something. We need the operational definitions in psychology because researchers are talking about constructs or things that you can't visually see. So we have to have a way to talk about them. Think about how words mean something different to different cultures. To avoid any confusion about definitions, we need to explain clearly what we mean, and we use certain terms. Okay? So, for example, if we want to measure anxiety, ask people how anxious they're feeling. Rate their anxiety on a scale from 1 to 10. Use an anxiety rating scale like the Health Anxiety Inventory or Fear Questionnaire. Measure their psychological responses, heart rate, muscle tension, things of that nature. Observe their behavior, escape or avoidance behavior. And you can do 1 or 2 or 3 of these things to try to make your information just as detailed as possible and make your results as accurate as possible. So these are kind of what we're talking about when we talk about operational definitions. What are we trying to observe? If we're trying to observe anxiety, how are we going to do that? What measures are we going to use in order to observe the anxiety? Are we just going to do 1? Are we going to do more than 1? Again, remember, when we're doing these kind of things, we have to take into account how people look at anxiety and how people experience those things when we're looking at our operational definitions. So let's talk about creating an operational definition. So let's say we want to measure age as it's related to addiction. So perhaps we want to know if addiction increases with age. So the older you are, the more likely you are to be addicted to a substance. So we have 2 measures here, age and addiction. So let's first talk about age. Now, you might think, that's pretty easy to define age. How will the researcher define age? It's how old somebody is. But are you going to define it in terms of years, or are you going to determine it in terms of months? How are you going to figure out someone's precise age? You know, is somebody who is 42 the same as somebody who is almost 43? Do we want to do it days and months? There's a lot of questions there that we want to look at when we're talking about age, not just saying, hey, we're going to look at age. Or even if you're going to say, I just want to measure the age in years, then you make sure that you say that in your thing. We're measuring age in years. Now, the second variable, addiction. So the variable addiction is slightly more complicated than age because we have to look at different things. So in order to do this, how we want to measure addiction. So we might narrow down the definition and say addiction defined as going through withdrawals when a person stopped using a substance. Or researchers might define addiction as if someone currently meets the DSM diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder. Or for the sake of this example, let's say we choose the latter. We say that they want to use the DSM in order to figure out if somebody is suffering from substance abuse. So we might say our definition for this operational problem here is, in the research study, age is defined as a participant's age measured in years, and the incidence of addiction is defined as whether or not the participant currently meets the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for any substance use disorder. So notice that we've been very specific about the two things we're trying to measure. We're talking about age, which seems, again, very simplistic, but we're telling them exactly we want to measure it in years. And then when we talk about addiction, we're saying they have to meet the criteria in this DSM to be considered a substance use disorder. So we've told you exactly what we want for age and addiction. So when we're doing these operational definitions, again, it's super important to make sure that we define it clearly so that everybody understands exactly what you're talking about at that moment, and they're not making any assumptions about what you don't want people making assumptions about what you're trying to talk about. You want to be as clear as possible. I hope everybody understands operational definition and construct. I know sometimes it can be a little bit of a confusing topic, so if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.